Dopamine swipe, dopamine swipe. Followers, likes, double tap. Now they control your life, Dopamine swipe.
Welcome back to the 817 podcast. We've got an exciting interview this week. So we got to sit down with Dr. Emily Farris, who is an assistant professor of political science at TCU. She specializes in American politics on issues of urban politics and racial and ethnic politics. And I know that she also has a good bit of research around sheriffs. So she teaches courses at TCU in American politics, survey research, urban politics, civil rights, and racial politics. We're really excited to talk to her about this election and the upcoming runoffs, as well as what the establishment in Fort Worth looks like.
And the big kicker here about Emily is she's a great Twitter follow, and you would enjoy this even more if you just riffed on her tweets for a little bit, because that's how excited we are, is because she's a super awesome person.
Yeah, and here she is. We're excited to welcome Dr. Farris.
Yeah, so I moved here for the job. I finished my PhD at Brown University and went on the job market for political science, tenure track jobs. And the way the academic job market works is there's usually only a handful of jobs each year. You don't really get much choice in terms of where you are, recruited or selected. I was fairly fortunate that I did have a couple of options. It came down between kind of LA here and San Antonio. And I liked TCU the best because it fit with what I had grown up with knowing. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. I went to college in Greenville, South Carolina at Furman University. Small, much smaller, but still kind of liberal arts feel, very undergrad focused. And so I wanted a university like that. And so, I moved here in 2013 and been here ever since, and got tenure at TCU. And so probably will stick around for quite some time. My parents also moved here.
Awesome.
Having been an only child and having a kid means we were fortunate that they got to come hang out here too.
Awesome. I feel like I share a lot of the frustrations of Fort Worth with you, at least from what I see online. What are like your maybe like top two favorite things about the city, and then top two things that if you were given free reign to change would be first on the chopping block?
As I said, Fort Worth is fairly familiar to me in that I wanted to be kind of in the South. I never really know if Texas is actually part of the South in my students debate. There's some aspects of the South that I like. It's comfortable for me. And so Fort Worth feels comfortable. The other thing I like about Fort Worth and dislike about Fort Worth is that there's lots of, same goes for my university, there's lots of opportunity for change and need for change. But the flip side, or maybe it's the same side of that coin, is that individuals really can make that change and have quite a large impact in a way that if I was in LA, it's just like laughable to me. Like, maybe I'd be on a podcast about LA politics, but it's just such a different world. And to have that, even though the election we're going to talk about, like a few thousand votes, right? In a city that is the 13th largest city in the country. But to still have that impact in a large city is really attractive to me. Two things that I would change. That's a good question. I have to prioritize the list of items. Well, I hope we're going to get to it, more into it, but I'd change engagement with the residents. I don't have the magic wand of how do you do that? How do you get people to read the news, to know, to care? But I think that that's a real detriment to our city, is that folks don't know really the power that local politics has in their lives, and don't, or even if they do know the power it has, they don't feel empowered themselves to make that change. So I would like to change that. I think would be one of the things that I would change. And related to that, I just think that, as I said, the Fort Worth has a lot of opportunity for change and things that need to be changed. In some ways, we're a city that's still stuck kind of like 1950s, 1960s on race relations, on segregation. I mean, all cities in the United States are segregated, but certainly Fort Worth is. We've never had a person of color be mayor. Like that's really backwards and not good for the city, period. And so those would be kind of the two I think I would want to tackle first. And then I'd hope from there other problems might trickle down and be solved as well.
For sure. I feel like that's a good transition into, every 2 years, local politics gets its time in the spotlight. And for us, that meant a little less than 14% of people decided to put it in the spotlight for themselves. When you saw the results, what were your initial gut reactions?
Well, there's a new newspaper in town, which I'm excited about, or I guess an online newspaper, the Fort Worth Reports. And I said this to them and I was kind of joking around with some people thinking about what would turnout actually be. Would we be able to break double digits? And I said to a reporter at that new outlet, it's both exciting to think we're going to get more turnout, right? We don't have an incumbent mayor running again. There's new faces. The council is going to look different. 2019, every single incumbent was reelected, right? And so, it's both exciting of there's going to be change. We're going to have higher turnout. But 14% is where we are amped to get at, that's so bad. That's just, as this is what I said in the piece, can we really consider ourselves a democracy if we're only at 14%? So I think that was my first kind of yay, 14.
Yeah.
I guess you get excited wherever you can. But then, some of the results, the races were really interesting. As I said, we all have new people on council. There were a lot of new candidates running, putting forth ideas that we hadn't seen previously. So even if they didn't win, a lot of them didn't win, or, we have some runoff situations happening, it's still fresh ideas. And you, as a political scientist, I think about long-term change and long-term patterns. And I think that this is maybe the start of a bigger shift in Fort Worth, I hope.
Yeah. Was there someone or a couple people in particular that stood out to you with those new ideas? So, in Carlos Flores's district, which is the historic kind of north side of Fort Worth, he had a challenger who did not win, Jen Sardui, and they really had a really progressive platform about policing, ideas about community care. They themselves are queer. We saw actually a couple of queer candidates run this first time. And those were just, Jen's ideas were just much more bolder than what I had seen from previous candidates, even progressive candidates kind of in the past. I think about Daryl Davis running against Jungus in 2019. And so, their campaign was one that I thought was really interesting. And just even how, again, thinking about long term, I donated to their campaign out of transparency, but they I wasn't involved in any of the campaign decisions or anything like that. They're doing a debrief on the campaign of why did we lose? What happened? What should we do going forward? Right? That's not, some candidates, they run, they lose. Yeah.
They disappear. They come back in 2 years. I really get the sense that, Jen and like her cohort of kind of folks she's working with are trying to build a longer term involvement and activism here in Fort Worth. And so, yeah, she was one, or they were one that was really exciting to me.
Yeah, I mean, even I feel like us, when we looked at their Instagram, it was like, oh, this is like actually being run in a much different way than any other local candidate.
Yeah. Yeah, and their platform was just much more comprehensive and thoughtful than you see the average platform.
Oh, yeah.
I think about I live in District 7, and so I also didn't have Dennis Shingleton is retiring, and so we're now in a runoff. But like the 3 top candidates are actually quite different from each other. But if you had to go search on their social media, or even if you were probably talking to them one-on-one, I'm not sure you'd get that. Like it'd be some kind of song and dance about like improving Fort Worth, better sidewalks, lower taxes.
Yeah.
But you really have to know. So like one of them, Zeb Pent, for instance, who's leading District 7 going into the runoff against Firestone. Like somebody posted on Twitter that they didn't know what he was about until after they had already voted for him, because they got a flyer in the mail that said something about like extreme social experiments, because Zeb Pent has a platform and kind of an agenda against transgender students. And she was like, wait, what is this about? And like, she didn't know, because you would never be able to go on their social media pages and tell. And I think that's one of the challenges of voters in Fort Worth, is that, it's nonpartisan, it's off cycle. How do you know who candidates are to be able to get a vote? It's tough. Yeah,
definitely. And I think like, unless you're like in the know enough to know that Pent sort of like tied himself to Steve Panate, like you would have no idea that like that's what he stands for at all. Yeah.
Although interestingly, Pent came before Panate. Pent's been long involved. And Pent actually came up through the same group that Byrd did. Byrd and Pent and Crane kind of all in the same, emerged out of 2017 together. So it was, I don't know who he went for, whether he was, because Byrd and Panate kind of split that vote.
Yeah.
And so I don't know where Pent stands on the two of them, but
yeah. So like 60% of Fort Worth voted in the 2020 presidential election, and like we went fairly blue. Like Tarrant County as a whole was only like 1,000 votes, but Fort Worth itself was fairly blue. What did you take out of, in general, the more progressive candidates really not performing very well?
Yeah, I mean, the electorates are just very different from what you're going to get in November, who turns out to vote in November versus who turns out to vote in May. And that's on purpose. That's designed to try to limit participation and to get different electorates out to vote. Fort Worth could change that. There's nothing required that we have off-cycle elections. Other cities have changed that to be on-cycle to try to deal with this turnout. There's also nothing that says we have to be nonpartisan either. Yeah. We could also choose to be partisan as well. There's all kinds of things we could choose. In fact, Austin, on their ballot, they had a bunch of different choices that we could have gotten into. Ranked choice voting, a stronger mayor system versus a city manager. But yeah, I mean, the electorate is different in May. And even the runoff, right? The runoff's going to be even worse in terms of turnout. And so that means you're really fighting for a very small portion of the city that tends to be wealthier, just higher SES, socioeconomic demographics. And that's going to tend to be a little bit more conservative than what you get in the general election in November. And so you're already, if you're a progressive candidate, a little bit disadvantaged just in terms of who you are pushing, trying to get to turn out to vote for yourself. So yeah, I mean, I think some candidates struggled a little bit. Lee Henderson in 7, came in 3rd. Jen's campaign, but Deborah coming in 1st. Deborah Peoples, the now former, she just resigned, chairwoman of the Tarrant Democrats. I think that does show a pretty big shift in that a field where she was pretty outspent and divided, that she came in 1st still shows, I think, that Fort Worth as a city is trending still to be more liberal, more progressive, however you want to phrase it, than it was 2 years ago, than it was 4, we could go back in time.
Yeah, I guess that's interesting. Our perception coming out of especially the mayoral race was a little bit discouraged just when you start adding up right-leaning versus left-leaning candidates. But what does turnout for a runoff like this typically look like? It percentage-wise versus who's going to show up again? Who was I had my candidate, they're not in it anymore, so I'm out? Or are there people that were I knew I was going to vote twice, and so I waited to only have to do it once? I feel like this is, for us, just new territory.
Yeah, I mean, there's not, in political science, unfortunately, there's not good local politics data, which is one of the themes of my research agenda, actually. But so we don't know. I can't tell you in this election or even in the last election, where does Fort Worth rank in terms of voter turnout? I can tell you historically where we've kind of been off 1 or 2 studies that we rank really low, usually second to last or actually last. So turnout's not going to be good. As a political scientist, I feel confident saying what previous years. So District 9, when Ann Zeta was first elected, went to a runoff. And turnout in that race was below 5%. I want to say 4, but I haven't looked at those numbers in years, so I don't know exactly. But that was a city council race, right? You didn't have the mayor, which is the top of the race. Although, we also have 6 at play here, the congressional race too, in some parts of the city, obviously not the entire city. But yeah, so I think it'll be higher than that. Maybe it'll put us back around 9% or so. Certainly some people, I would imagine, Penate did a lot better than I think anyone expected him to do. And so I think probably a lot of his voters might not shift back to Parker, or might not shift neatly to Parker. She's going to have to figure out how to capture some of those. Byrd voters might be a little bit better. Zeta voters, I would expect, would mostly go to Peoples. But again, if you were, I really think if you were a strong, hardcore, Byrd or Penate voter, those are the ones you're potentially losing. And I'm not sure that hurts or helps Parker and Peoples that much. Either way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I definitely feel that with Steve's voters, that was his crew, and if he's not in it, then they're not gonna show up. But how much weight does endorsements carry?
Yeah, I was talking to someone, I don't remember who, it didn't run, some reporter, that I really don't know who the consultants were, who was in these folks' ears to run. I would imagine that whoever wanted Parker in the race is really mad that Byrd ran.
Yeah.
And I would imagine whoever was in Byrd's campaign was really mad that Penate ran. So, you know, like it was just kind of like all the way down. Everybody's mad that we're there because they really, you know, for conservative, even more moderate, you know, Byrd could pull in some more moderate voters as well too. They really, split each other's vote. And Penate did so well that if he had ran for, I don't know where he lives in the city, but he could have very easily, I imagine, won a city council race. And so it's interesting why, I don't know him, I've never met him, but why did he choose to run for mayor first and not like, let me do one round on city council or two like Byrd and then move on up? I'm not sure.
Yeah. What's your take on the congressional seat and how we did not get a Democrat in the final two? What's your thoughts there?
Yeah. I didn't really expect a Democrat to win. That's a conservative district still. I do think it's shifting. I think it's tough having an open race and having, you know, the deceased incumbents, you know, the widow run, and that it was then a lot of Democrats jumped in. If there had been some kind of consolidation around like, we're all in on Sanchez, right? And like, we're not, it might have been, well, it certainly would have been easier for one candidate, but to me, it's just still a Republican district. That's a leaning Republican district.
Yeah, it was very interesting how national it got, I guess, too. I guess like as local people, we felt like that, but the national people kind of made you feel a little excited. Like, why is New York Times or Politico talking about this? Because we don't have
anything else to talk about. They are election junkies. They don't. You know, they don't do a lot about local elections, although it's interesting when Betsy Price first ran in 2011, there was a piece in the New York Times about her running and the Dallas mayoral election as well, too. But yeah, I mean, these big national newspapers want to go where there's some like interesting story. Certainly that guy, I've already forgotten his name. This is how quick I've moved. I don't follow congressional races that closely, but the guy who like just ran and now moved to Texas and was like riding bulls and pretend cowboy. Like,
that like the Utah guy from Utah.
I thought it was
story.
He's like the wrestler. Is he not the wrestler? Isn't there a crazy wrestler, like the WWE wrestler?
Yeah.
And all his posters had him and Trump on it, but Trump endorsed Susan. So yeah.
I mean, certainly that's another race that pulled some turnout probably as well too. It was also really interesting thinking about candidates on the Democratic side and thinking about maybe, you know, were there too many? It was Sean Lasseter originally ran for District 7, put in and filed for District 7, which is, as I said, my district. District 7 does not overlap with the 6th congressional district. Most Americans probably don't know, but there's nothing in the Constitution that requires you, if you're a member of the House, to actually live in your district. You just have to live in the state. So I could live in El Paso and run for a representative seat in Fort Worth if I wanted to. That probably is not a great but anyway, so yeah, Lasseter, and she had like, you know, people out of Florida, Democrats in Florida helping with her campaign. And it would have been really great. You know, I would have voted for 7. But yeah, it was interesting to see how that one played out.
Do you think she would have had a chance to make the runoff in 7?
Yeah, I don't know. 7 is I'm still like sorting and processing all my feelings about 7 right now. 7 is a weird district. It stretches from basically kind of like if you're in probably most of your listeners are in Fort Worth, but like Central Market, right? Like 30 Hulen, all the way up to the Motor Speedway. It takes like 30 minutes to drive that district. It's also one of the larger districts now with redistricting. I expect it'll be sliced up a little bit. But so it's a very odd district. You have kind of like pretty like urban areas of as urban as Fort Worth gets, all the way up to really suburbs. And so it's tough to kind of think who can win. And I think what showed is that the results from, going into the runoff show that you need a lot of money. You're not going to be able to knock every door. So you got to get out flyers. And that's how Firestone did it. And then you need some kind of base of voters, which is probably what Pent has. And so I don't know if she would have had either. I definitely think she would have been an interesting candidate if she had stayed in. She and Henderson might have split some votes.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure how it would have gone down.
Yeah, we're both Texas 6 voters. And it's great. 3 or 4 Democrats all spent over $200K in the race. There was a lot of money that went into it.
Yeah. For so small votes. Right?
Yeah.
I did the math a while back. That you could give each individual voter a couple of $100.
Yeah.
Go vote for me versus all these silly flyers and, signs. But somebody's making money off of it. It's not voters. Epstein's group and others are getting their money. And then this time, the other interesting thing was to see who candidates used as their campaign managers / consultants and whatnot. And really just increasingly outsiders down in Austin, even Zeta's campaign having outsiders. Sixth as well, that national interest. It definitely is a shift from kind of old Fort Worth style of doing politics and who they go to for experience. Yeah,
that's an interesting point. And I feel like Mayor Price gets a lot of quotes to say, this isn't how we do it in Fort Worth. And using that.
So her campaign manager has always been based out of Dallas, which has always been funny. He's actually, I think, east of Dallas. So, yeah.
Surprise, surprise.
And that's the same person running Parker's campaign.
Okay. Do you think for the runoff that the gloves are going to come off a little bit? I think Byrd tried to play a little bit more aggressive later on in his campaign. But do you think Parker and Peoples are going to go at it a little bit more?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I think Byrd got reprimanded in a way for trying to go negative and just having some blunders. I think Byrd really stumbled thinking that, I'm not sure, as I said, I don't advise any campaign, so I don't know who they get advice from and don't have any kind of insight into who those folks are. But Byrd really thought, I think, probably that he was going to get the police endorsement, given that he's been such a strong supporter of the police as council member, that he'd get more of the kind of religious vote. And so he'd have that base to then kind of step out on. And he really just got kind of the wind knocked out of him for that. And I think, for Parker, she's clearly trying to thread the needle the same way Price does.
Yeah.
And saying that, I'm not partisan. There's not, Price loves to say there's not a Republican or Democratic way to pave a street, which is absolutely not true. There are, if we local politics is nonpartisan. A lot of people think that's a good thing, that it means that politicians will then step out and start thinking about their constituents and put this kind of quote unquote nasty partisan politics to the side. That's not actually how it works. It means that people don't know who you are or how to think about you. It means that politicians can not maybe be the most honest at all times, right? They can kind of have this cloak over them in terms of what they say and how they act. And I think that's what Parker does. I think that's what Price does too. These are, two women who have been Republicans their entire lives.
Yeah.
Parker's pretty much with the exception, of more recently with her nonprofit work, she's worked for Republicans her entire life. She's a Republican. Like, and so is it better for voters to not know that? Or is it better just to be honest with voters and her just, to say, I'm running as a Republican, but yeah, I'll put to have the same, she could have the same messaging, but it could just be a little more honest. The reason why I don't think either of them will particularly like turn a nasty corner is because both of them have tried to build their platforms as being inclusive of Fort Worth. They both have different definitions, obviously, of what that inclusivity means. But both of them are trying to say that they are the more kind of inclusive candidate. They are the, in Parker's case, the kind of nonpartisan candidate. And to kind of step into that more negative ground really destroys that message. So I don't expect, plus, I haven't really watched Parker. Obviously she's never done anything in politics before, as herself as the politician, but I expect her to be like Price and Peoples to run the same way that she ran in 2019. And neither of those just really run really negative campaigns. But I do think, they'll have to distinguish themselves from each other. We'll see that in some debates coming up for voters. But I think probably voters pretty much know who these people are and where they go.
Well, I feel like Maddie, and learning more and caring about it, that the establishment is real, and this pyramid we talk about, and this power that is backed behind Maddie. What is your kind of take on power in Fort Worth and how that works on, like, them going so supportive over Maddie in that situation, and almost feeling I don't know, suppressive in a way of like, do you actually have hope to create influence in Fort Worth because it's so held close? What is can you share from your experience with Fort Worth?
Yeah. So when I moved to Fort Worth in 2013 and started getting kind of interested in local politics, I moved right when I initially lived in District 9. And so it was right when Zeta was first getting elected, and had some conversations with her and some others. And Fort Worth, just initially shocked me. I've lived in Birmingham, I've lived in Baton Rouge, I've lived in Greenville and DC and Providence, and I've studied Hartford as well too. So I've spent a lot of time in Hartford. Each of those cities, I have been able to find who are my insiders, who's going to talk just nerdy politics with me, what city councilor wants to gab, wants to gossip often about who they dislike, who will in Providence invite me in, let's come over for dinner and I'll tell you everyone involved. I came to Fort Worth and I was like, okay, so who are my people? Who are we going to do this? None of them. None of them. So that was different for me. And that's when, when I started this saying Fort Worth in some ways feels really backwards. That's one of the ways, is that the power structure is still so closed and still so, every city operates off of, not every city in America can't do what it wants to do on its own. It just doesn't have enough funding. It doesn't have enough resources. It has to rely somewhat on a private sector to get things done. And so that often means people who have money, or people who are very organized. But often it means money. And so in some ways Fort Worth is not unique in that sense, but other cities have activists and other groups have been able to kind of puncture that in a way that hasn't really here in Fort Worth. And so, I think some people might dismiss the kind of West 7th gang as being outdated. And certainly maybe some of the characters have changed, but it's kind of not a conspiracy if it's actually true.
Yeah.
It's actually really, and you just look at Parker. She's never been in politics before. And she had every single endorsement, just coming down and the money. And so that's why I say, like, it's not a conspiracy if it's actually true, because, you know, the power elite chose Parker as this is who our candidate's going to be. Even, you know, in the really interestingly, when like it first opened up, you know, Price isn't going to run. Who's going to fill the gap? DJ Kelly ran, like at least put his name in to run. He's one of the ones, like his family historically in the power brokers, and certainly himself, right? Like you just have to kind of walk on my campus and see who are these buildings named after. Kind of trace the families. So we have the Kelly Alumni Center. And so, but he pulled out, I think, when Byrd decided to run, interestingly, and then like everything went to Parker. So we could have had a really interesting, like, kind of who's going where in a way that we actually saw in the water district. Most people don't care at all about the water district in Fort Worth. It's like really kind of interesting that it's more of a bigger deal. But like in the water district, you saw candidates who were either aligned with Kay Granger because her son runs, you know, over there, or with Betsy Price because Price and Granger have kind of had this falling out. So you saw kind of like a crack in the establishment, but like locally, no, like they all lined up behind Parker. You're not wrong in thinking it's like a bit of a suppressive conspiracy to try to. It is. I mean, that's what it is. They've chosen who they want, and you know, Peoples is really kind of remarkable when you think about how many small, you know, donations she got, how outfunded she was in the race, and how well she still came in first.
Yeah, and I think that's where like what's unfortunate about it is, so we both endorsed Ann Zeta on the pod and voted for Ann Zeta. But I think looking at the establishment, and you just think what happened with like George Floyd this year, what happened with like, you know, a big hit being like Fort Worth's a minority city, a majority minority city. Like you thought some maybe, I don't know, I guess people would support kind of this, like, you know, a lot of these people red, white fragility or whatever, or how to be an anti-racist. You think they were going to like pull it off. But, I felt like nobody really broke off to say we need representation in Fort Worth. Like nobody really came over.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, we've talked about how Panate and Byrd kind of split the vote. I think probably, you know, Peoples and Zeta were going for the same kind of pool of voters. I'm not sure, you know, I think it was people said, you know, the second pretty much 2019 was done running again. And so it was never really a surprise. I'm not sure, you know, what kind of prompted or motivated Zeta knowing that going in, as well as knowing all of the events that you mentioned over this past year. So, yeah, I mean, I think somebody obviously was telling Zeta that she was going to do a lot better than she ended up doing. But yeah, it's not, you know, and for the People's Campaign, they really haven't made a lot of those things be major issues here in Fort Worth, as you mentioned, EJ. And so I think that's strategic. I think some of these things don't have to be said, right? If you are, you know, a voter, you know all of this, and you can very clearly see that Deborah Peoples does not need to stand up and say necessarily as a Black woman, this is what I represent. She just needs to be there, and you know. But I also think, she's not. Somebody on Twitter said, like, you know, they were mapping out the candidates across like an ideological spectrum. And I said, yes, they're right, because they had put like Zeta and Peoples more on the left and put Parker and the kind of like middle and whatnot. And I said, yes, you're right. But like on the grand political spectrum, like Peoples and Zeta, neither of them are really that liberal.
Yeah.
Like, if we were, I mean, obviously we're not, but like if we were in New York City, like they would be the like on the right side, you know? And so it's interesting. Yeah. What kind of our issues, because I mean, Fort Worth obviously has had major police brutality cases with the Tatiana Jefferson. even before that. And so those haven't really come up as much as we might have thought.
Yeah, I guess for me, because I felt like it for me feels like even when Deborah did she did an interview on our pod, but she did an interview on the Fortitude podcast, which you can tell she was like, I could be Republican. She said, quote unquote, I could be Republican. I could be like, you could tell she was like, I feel like, and then when you bring up police, I think everything for her is like, I know how big the Fort Worth establishment is. And so I need to like almost like agree with it at some rather than go on the more anarchy approach of just like, hey, and I guess for me, it's like now that you're down to 2, I just don't, I think she asked the ruffle feathers in some way of saying that they're not representing one Fort Worth like we are. And here's an example. Here's all the examples of how they don't. These people voted for Donald Trump. We all went out and vote, not because of Joe Biden. We did because of fear of Donald Trump. And I feel like voters won't come out unless you can create a fear-based plan. And I feel that's why I feel like she's unfortunately not going to win.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't. TCU hasn't funded my polling center yet. to polling, and I don't think it's really tough to poll in Fort Worth and to know. I think she's got an uphill battle. I think though that she came in first is really a big testament to people buying into her vision and believing. I just, I have spent very little time with her. I hosted one of the mayoral forums in 2019, and so I got to hear her then. But I don't think she is like particularly that radical. Just genuinely, like that's just not who she is. So I don't think she's necessarily. I mean, I do think she's been Democratic chairwoman. She is very smart and thus strategic. And I think, that's not a bad word. For me, being strategic is a good thing. I want politicians to be strategic. But yeah, so her brother is a police officer, so she's got a connection to law enforcement. She wasn't, my dad worked for AT&T for years. She was an executive at like a major corporation. That doesn't breed activism in the same way, but she very clearly, But
her campaign's very I feel like the other problem is like her campaign though is like, even if you compare it to Jen Sardui, who got less than 400 votes, her marketing is like Windows 98. Like it's like the design of her. You're the chair of the Tarrant Democratic Party. Like I feel like Sean Lasseter. Like how do you get some of that Sean Lasseter flair in this bad boy? Like I just feel like she's not. That's to me that's like frustrating. It's like I don't feel like she's. I don't know. I just.
Trying to connect with young voters.
Thing.
Yeah.
Jen got 650 votes, just so I know Jen's campaign doesn't get mad at me. But I think this.
I was looking at her.
She's a different era. Obviously, when she and Price were running, like the average age was like 70 of that race. And so, Parker is younger. Has more money to hire consultants who can do this kind of flashier marketing. And maybe like, you and I are not the target voters.
Yeah,
true.
Unfortunately, when thinking about, I'm making some assumptions, I guess, about your age, but, we are not the target demographic. And so if you're trying, there's like 2 ways to win. You can either expand the electorate, right? Bring in new voters, or you can compete for the voters are going to turn out. I think she is more, she's trying to do both. And I think she's been successful in bringing new people in. Obviously turnout was up, and not just because we had like Panate and others running. But she is also really trying to compete for voters that she knows are consistent, who maybe don't need, like they might need like, Black church leaders to say like, make sure you get out to vote on Sunday, right? That doesn't need to come in like a Facebook post that might appeal to us, or an Instagram post. Now, whether that's like an effective strategy for whoever's after her, right? Like if she runs and wins, I don't know. I always say I want to retire like the second I can. You're going to see me peace out like on a beach. Like you're not going to see me run. You're never going to see me run for anything, but you're especially not going to see me like working hard at 70 for this. And so, I have to think it's really interesting to me that she resigned as Tarrant Dem leader right now. But like, who's next, and who are we thinking about bringing in and expanding the electorate? And having flashier, better marketing stuff is something that's going to appeal to younger generations. But that stuff just costs a lot of money.
Yeah.
And so if you don't have it yourself, where you we've talked a lot about Jen's campaign, but Jen's campaign has that kind of they didn't have a lot of money, but they had those instincts, right? They're in a different generation. I don't think People's campaign has that.
Well, that's also kind of my fear though as well. Like, one, I'm voting for Deborah Peoples. But I guess like my fear though is like, then that also turns up into like lack of 21st century policies in the sense of like, like I think of Francis Suarez in Miami and this idea of the power of freshness and him talking about how I invested in Bitcoin. Like, I think that like, especially as the 13th biggest city who's trying to get 21st century people work here, relevant jobs. Yeah. That to me is also like, I get how she may not need it to win an election, but you're going to probably need it to build a 21st century city.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so in 2019, I guess because there was an incumbent running and nobody cared, there were only two. Yeah, I think there were only two mayoral forums, and Price just didn't show up to one of them. She had some family reason why she didn't show up, but she just straight didn't show up to one of them. And so the only one she came to was the TCU one that I hosted, which only had 400 people show up.
Oh, that's pretty good though.
Which again, yeah, I mean, I was happy, but that's not that many people.
That's like 1% of people who voted.
My students asked questions. My students wrote all the questions. It was not me, and I did not prompt them, unlike what one campaign manager says. They wrote all the questions, and one of the questions that my students asked that I thought was really good was, if I gave you $1 million, each of the candidates, I give you $1 million, you're mayor of Fort Worth, there's no ties, you can spend it on whatever you want. What do you want to spend it on? Price said something about early childhood education, which has just always kind of baffled me because, again, that's her way of being nonpartisan, I think. But the mayor does nothing with education. That's a silly answer. But anyways, getting to my point, because the crowd was mostly young and it was my students and stuff, she said she would spend it on scooters. And my students were the next day when I was debriefing with them, right? All these Lime scooters. Now I think most people kind of dislike them because they end up everywhere on sidewalks. Right?
They're the worst.
Even my students were like, we don't want scooters. No, that's not, I just gave you $1 million to do whatever. Don't buy me a scooter. But that to me just kind of I think my students read through it of what you're trying here, but it's kind of falling flat. Yeah. It's not really doing that. Now, so I can equally pick on Price did the same thing in a different way. Price in 2019 created this somewhat fake micro targeting on Instagram where she had these fake kind of memes that her campaign made, but made it seem like somebody else was doing it, which again is just that we can pretty easily see through this kind of stuff, right? That's not very authentic. But it does bring up really, I mean, I think that's one way Parker's trying to distinguish herself as being that I'm the first millennial mayor. I'll be a big city millennial mayor. Yeah, I mean, it's another dimension of representation that she thinks she can do better on. But she doesn't speak to me particularly as she's a year older than me. But she's not that young. Millennials nowadays are not that young. So
yeah, I agree.
Do you feel like this is the closest, tying back to the idea of the establishment in Fort Worth, do you think this is the closest to maybe having a bigger rupture in it, as far as if Peoples is elected, does that group see the mayoral position in the same way that they have before? With the like District 6 runoff, there's a chance that the council even sways, maybe 5-4, a little bit more progressive. Like, is this as close as Fort Worth has gotten to something like this?
Yeah, I mean, there's been people in the past who have challenged the establishment and had various success, and we're going way back, and like the establishment, for instance, for most cities across America, off the East Coast, the kind of like more the younger cities, all had at-large election up until the 1970s, including Fort Worth. Some still do and are still fighting the lawsuits, right? Like Austin just recently swapped to district. That was like a challenge to the Fort Worth way, right? When like we got district elections, meaning that they can't all come from like north of Camp Bowie and like that little area of Fort Worth. So yeah, I mean, I think this is a challenge. I do think it's interesting, like the real way to dig into this, which nobody wants to do, and it's like very tedious to do, is to look at the campaign finance reports and to see who's funding. It's very tedious to do, even if you try to look into it, because sometimes they're funding through PACs. And so it's not like, oh, well, that's Ed Bass right there who just gave $50,000. But like, no, it's his good government PAC that gave $50,000 to Parker. But like Peoples, interestingly, has had a lot of grassroots small donations. That's the majority. But she did have a couple of like developers, like real estate developers, give her money. And I thought that's a sign that like some people are trying to hedge their bets, that like we want to make sure that if this goes differently, we still have an in to what's happening in Fort Worth. So yeah, I mean, I think, they've gone really hard for Parker. People are going to lose some money if they don't, if their bet doesn't pay off. Yeah,
I did do a lot of digging through the April 1st campaign finance reports, and there's one lawyer's office somewhere in downtown that, I mean, donated to Parker under like 10 different names, but it all came from that address. And I was like, okay, like this is what we're like talking about when we feel like the establishment is coming together.
And there's not campaign limitations the same way there are for federal elections too. And so you really can have a bigger impact. And we're trying to, essentially buy, which is what campaign donations are, if you only have to buy a small number of votes, right? It's a better bang for your buck than having to compete if we had on-cycle elections. If we had on-cycle elections, it would be much more expensive. Now, that would actually price out some candidates that we might think of as more progressive and have negative implications too. And so it'd be a trade-off of like, greater turnout. But now we've really like made candidates have to fight for a stage against this national election. It's now more expensive, a challenge. But yeah, I mean, I think good for you for wanting to dig through that. It's tough. It's really hard to try to figure out who are these people, where are they, where is this money being spent? The information's not always like the most transparent.
I really enjoyed the conversation. I really appreciate your time and coming on. And
thanks. Well, yeah, I mean, Fort Worth's tough. That's great that you've gotten access to folks. And I hope that's like a shift, is that people realize that they need to consult outside of this small brokers or power elite. But like, folks like us actually do care and want to be involved and are invested in our city. And just because we might disagree on certain issues doesn't mean that we don't all have like the same end goal at heart of like having this be a place that we all live and want to see do better. And so I'm hopeful that maybe this election like shakes up some of that. Hopefully, I don't know. I don't really have much of a filter, so I don't think I said anything too bad that's going to get anyone who's not already mad at me even more mad at me.
Oh, we have to make sure we hit Carrie Moon take? What's your response to Carrie Moon? What's your response? He won.
No, see, that's where.
Don't worry. I called Jack Stevens an ass a couple episodes ago, and yeah,
It came back.
no.
Oh.
But I felt bad for a minute, but then he was still trying to push like hiring his new GM, so I didn't feel bad anymore.
Carrie Careless Moon.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think Carrie is like the old Fort Worth that we really don't need, of somebody who thinks that they can get away with things and not actually be accountable to voters, which is evident just by him like not wanting to engage in like being a politician means you have to take shit. Like you have to be like, you're going to be criticized.
Yeah.
You're going to have people who disagree with you, maybe passionately disagree with you. And I've stood before council. I take my students to council every fall and have them sit and watch. We do 2 different sessions and like talk about what are we seeing, what are we doing. And my students every time notice both Carrie, but also Bird would do this too, although sometimes he's a little better, just sit on their phones and like not pay attention to people who are talking. And to me, that's so rude. You know, people are taking time out of their day to come down to City Hall and, you know, in an intimidating arena. They're not used to maybe going down in front of a microphone and talking like, you know, we might be okay with, but others not. And to talk about something that matters, you know, is something pretty important to them. And to be on your phone is just so rude. To like think that you can, you know, in 2021, you own a bar, you know about Uber, whatever. Like, don't drink and drive. That's so dumb. It's just absolutely, yeah. And so I just can't stand that kind of attitude.
Yeah.
I don't have to listen. I'm not accountable. You know, for whatever it is, like, you know, other people that I disagree with, Shingleton, my city councilor, I often disagree with. At least he would listen, right?
Yeah.
Like, I can respect that at least. But Carrie Moon doesn't. I'm really disappointed that he was reelected.
Yeah. Tara was great. We had her on too, and she kind of really brought the heat on that one. I felt like she's like, he was driving through our neighborhood, so it's like, ooh, this is good. I was like, I'm so hopefully this works. Like, but she did well.
He just recently, like a couple of sessions ago, opposed a liquor license for a restaurant.
I saw that.
It was too close to a school. And it's like, dude, you were 0.2 or something. I don't know the exact distance. I did look it up at the time. From a school when you were driving drunk. I mean, granted, you were driving drunk at 2 a.m. There weren't kids out there.
Yeah.
But, like the principle of like, you think that you get to speak on this topic. It's just like, yeah, the hubris. He's lacking something. I think though I'll be curious to see what he wants to do in the future. I do think that the DWI probably limited his ambition, that he and Bird are buddies in some ways. They have a weird relationship, but like he might have run if Bird hadn't run. If he didn't have the DWI, I think he might have wanted to be mayor. But I think like Jungus, who also doesn't listen very well and is not in touch with his district, Jungus had a challenger in 2019 who did not do as well as I think some people thought he would, but obviously is now facing, he's in a runoff.
Yeah.
I think probably Carrie as well.
Yeah, Jungus
is against Jared Williams.
Yeah, just combining Jared and
Tisha.
And Tisha, like Jungus looks like he's in a tough spot.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like yeah. Those are 2 people that I think represent older ways of doing things in Fort Worth, and having new leadership will be exciting. I mean, one of the things that Jen's campaign pointed out rightfully, which I think is true everywhere in all cities across America, but just the percentage of times that the entire council voted together. That's okay. A lot of the votes that come before the council, which is one of the things why I take students to see the council, aren't necessarily that exciting or like that. Like, we're not having big philosophical debates every time before an election or before the votes for council, but some of them are. And sometimes it's okay. Like, I don't know. It's funny because I'm from the South, but I guess I lived in the North long enough. Like, I'm okay with disagreement. I'm okay with some political fighting. And for you to walk out and be like, I don't like you. Don't talk to me right now. We'll come back in 2 weeks and we'll work it out. But right now, I'm mad at, and like, it's interesting to me, Dallas, for being like kind of two cities, Dallas is much more comfortable with that conflict, right? With that friction of on council. And I think that's actually good. More people become interested, more people like, are like, what's going on, and maybe like get sucked into politics that way. More people might feel represented. This like kind of kumbaya Fort Worth politics is a little too nice, I think, sometimes. So I'm excited to have some shakeup of maybe some people who are willing to step out and just be like, no, I don't agree with that. And Zeta was willing to do that, to her credit, a few times on council. But really, like, none of the others were.
Yeah, she, I feel like the last couple times that especially independent redistricting came up, she was willing to be the 1 versus 8 on that, especially.
Yeah.
And I want to...
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if the others get bought in or, bought off.
Yeah, I want to make sure that we hit this answer. So, because I saw that you tweeted about it, how might we update the 1995 article on Who Runs Fort Worth? Just, is there a clear update? I know we kind of talked about it.
I think my next tweet of Charlie from Always Sunny drawing the kind of conspiracy line is that it's not clear. It's not as small of a group as it was in the first article was actually written in 85, and then they did an update in 95, and then there was an update sort of 3 years ago. The group is bigger than it used to be, but it's still the same. It's still largely white, Anglo in Texas terms, a lot of men, but very wealthy people controlling a lot of Fort Worth politics. That maybe a few of the names, it's not as many Bass names as once was, some of those kids have moved, but it's still a lot of the same mindsets or ideology running Fort Worth. But I think that is changing, and I think it's to the credit of folks like United Fort Worth, like Pamela Young, who are really committed, dedicated, pushing, and like in it for the long haul of being involved since like 2017 or earlier as well.
Yeah.
So I would say updated, cracking, still really pale.
We were,
hopefully that doesn't get me in trouble with any of the trustees.
Well, my part was Sid about too was like a lot of it's inheritance rather than founder, like from a capitalist perspective, like it's not like the founders of companies, it's the inheritance of companies. And that just creates a different demeanor in a city from like, I guess having a Bezos or a Tesla or an Elon's a very different than having, I was born into billions of dollars. So you kind of have like, I think elephants are important in a zoo, and rather than like, I think like, we should do something, like let's try to get Tesla here or something. I don't know, whatever, like a founder DNA would be.
Elon Musk far away.
Yeah.
With her margarita post.
Stargate, Texas.
So it's funny you mentioned the zoo. Apparently something went down in the 80s that's like briefly mentioned in that piece about the zoo, and I didn't have time to like go hunt down what big hoopla went down at the zoo. But yeah, it's a lot of the same old names we're still talking about for folks. Now, are their kids as interested in all of this as like the fathers and grandfathers are? Not really. And so I do think that there is going to be a bit of a vacuum, but Fort Worth still has like a lot of wealth that's really concentrated, and is really segregated. And so, will the next group look different? I don't know, probably not, just based on like what's America. But like, yeah, it's a lot of inherited wealth. We don't have anyone new really shaking things up. There's not the Elon Musk just like, coming in, or Andrew Yang.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
There's not somebody new moving in, but like I could see it happening. I could definitely see like some, I don't know, healthcare company coming in or big
Yeah.
real estate company coming in and bringing in that. But it goes back to your point of like, we want to attract that 21st century capital to the city. And what are we doing? Like, you know, like the big accomplishment of Price was getting that like Facebook server. Like, you know, that's not,
It's like 100,
like,
it's like 100 people, right? Like, I don't think a lot of people work
Yeah.
there.
No.
And so, yeah, who would come in to do that is it's possible, but I don't know who. But it could change. Yeah. It's hard. I mean, I'll go back to what I started. When I came to Fort Worth, it was like, all right, tell me who to talk to. And it was like, no, there's nobody. There's like, they exist, but they don't want to talk to you. They have their people. And it's the people they go to their country club with, they go to the exchange club to eat. Their kids grew up going to, you know, the same private schools. And so like, that's a very elite world that still operates here in Fort Worth. And is certainly like the next generation is probably, I won't say the name of the schools, but they're probably right now already being groomed for like what's going to happen. But the other thing that like I didn't get to plug, which is usually what I try to plug also when thinking about local politics, is like the mayor's job pays $29,000, right? And city council pays $25,000. You can't run without being independently wealthy, without having some kind of position that lets you, or, you know, being able to be comfortable somehow, you know, like you've just like personally decided that like, yeah, I'm okay living on that kind of salary. And so for a lot of people, even like, you know, fairly upper middle class people aren't willing or able to take that cut to do that, what is really a full-time job.
Yeah.
Now, Fort Worth also is like a manager, city manager. We don't talk enough about like the man behind the curtain, who's not even behind the curtain. He's sitting up there on the dais as well too. We didn't get into that as well, but like, you know, who wants to do this job where you don't have that much power, you aren't getting paid a lot, and you're gonna have people yell at, you know, like you're gonna be like Carrie Moon and have to like block me on Twitter because I'm gonna say things like, you know, that's a very unique person who was driven to want to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I mean, we do have more to talk about if you want to come on another time. And I do think like talking about the city manager setup and having a mayoral position that's really just a glorified city councilor and how that plays into the structure of the city and being a little more suburban than 21st century 13th biggest city.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, it'll be interesting. Does this next mayor bike? Like, is she going to be somebody who just like wants to go around biking around the city? Like, probably not. We have real problems in Fort Worth, and we need real leadership. That's not just like.
She also ran the marathon. Like she's way more active than I am. I mean, I'll give her credit. That's like kind of crazy.
Yeah, she did a relay. Again, when I'm 70, don't come for me. I'm just sitting on a beach. Like, you're not running a marathon. Yeah, no, I would love to. And like, as I said, I teach urban politics in the fall. My students and I have these conversations all the time. I'm really excited about the new publication in Fort Worth. I hope there will be increased eyes on the council. I'm glad you guys are talking about it. I'm always down to chit chat.
Awesome.
Yeah, if you ever feel like there's just a rant that's longer than a tweet, you know, we'll be happy to have you just lay it on everybody. That'd be awesome. It'd be a great honor.
Nobody needs that. But I think people would be willing to be more involved if they knew, but it's just such a, you know, as y'all can probably attest, like just learning, okay, who are all the people running? Like that's a lot of people to try to sort through. It's a lot to ask of people to try to figure out. But once you do, it's a lot of fun to talk about, to think about.
Yeah, we agree. And for now, we just get to read Luke Ranker's tweets of city council every week and be the group of 10 or 15 of us that like his posts.
Yeah, Luke knows when we have signed up.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's the thing is like, right? Like right now, as we've been talking, city council met. I have no clue what they did or talked about. I saw something in dealing with the stockyards came through. I don't go to council every week. That's impossible. I don't want to do that, and so it's tough to try to stay involved.
Yeah.
Anyways. All right. Well, this was fun.
Yeah. Thank you so
Emily.
much for your time.
That was Dr. Emily Farris, again, Assistant Professor of Political Science at TCU. Please go check out her Twitter at EMAY Farris. She is an awesome, awesome person here in Fort Worth who provides great insights, depth, and perspective. It was an honor to have her on the show. Please subscribe, share with a friend as we continue to deliver shows every Monday morning. Peace.
Double tap. Now they control your life, control your life.